I'm Dick McGuire, descendant of the McGuires here on this farm. Where the story really begins in 1885. This farm is located in the town of Jackson, about 8 miles north of Cambridge, 5 miles south of Salem. My grandparents grew up in this area, and they got married in 1884. And soon after that, they answered an advertisement in the newspapers for Eastern farm boys to run farms for absentee owners in Illinois. And so in 1885, they moved to Hinckley, Illinois, which is a little town about 50 miles west of Chicago. They farmed 2 farms for 10 years out there, but my grandmother was very homesick for Washington County, and they had a couple tornadoes that went close by that she didn't appreciate, and so she persuaded her husband that they ought to come back to Washington County. So my grandfather and grandmother and 2 children that were born out there loaded all their livestock they needed, they could bring home, sold the rest of it at auction, and arrived back in Salem in 1895. They bought this little farm at 60 acres, and my father was born here in 98. 1920, he added 20 acres that came up for sale close by, so he had a total of 80 acres. My father took over the farm in 1920 when he got married, and my grandfather and grandmother moved into Salem where they retired. In 1935, we rented a 160-acre farm next door, so we had a total of 240 acres. Up until that time, and on till 1941, we farmed with teams of horses. We got our first tractor in 1941. So I had 19 years of farming with horses and milking cows with hand milking machines and doing everything the way it had been done for the previous 50, 60 years. After I graduated from college, we bought the farm, and then when I got married, Polly and I moved into the old farmhouse. I added 2 other farms of about 120 acres, one of them and another one of 80, so we had about 300 acres more onto the farm. 200 acres more onto the farm. So we had a total of 440 acres, and that was Penope Farms. The name comes from an Algonquin Indian dictionary that and it means east view. It's an Algonquin Indian word, Penope. The old farm buildings behind me, which I've altered some, added on a few things, but original building with the cupola was built in 1830, and the middle part of the big barn was built about 1790. The museums the building with the cupola was the first museum. That was the old grain house, where they kept corn and oats to feed the cattle and the pigs, and that was my first museum. As I said, I collected things off the farms that I'd added, and just kind of stored them in the barns, and in about 1980, I started organizing them in the first museums. And over the years, people have brought me things. When they come to see the museums, they say, well, I've got something you ought to have. And I've bought some things at auctions that I didn't have, and just kept growing till now I have 11 different rooms, kind of separate museums, and yet part of the total of Penope Farms museums. As the sign says, this collection of these museums is called Past Particles Museums and Old Yesterday's Farm Tools. The theme is I tried to collect and show all the things used in farms, and in the buildings, in homes, in the fields, and in the barns. This first museum is things used in homes. Follow me into the first museum, where we're going to see things used in the late 1800s and the early 1900s in the homes on farms. In this corner we have the old phonograph that was most farmers, most families had in the early 1900s. This was about 1910. Played records. It was a form of entertainment in the house. Here's a radio run by a 12-volt battery. Our first radio had on the farm, 1925, and a loudspeaker. It also had earphones. This is a gasoline stove. You know, we had wood-burning kitchen stoves that threw off a lot of heat as well as when you're cooking the meals. And so in the summertime, they didn't want all that heat in the house, so they had these little kerosene stoves put out on the back porch. This is a little oven that goes with it, so they didn't heat up the house and use up wood. This happens to be something unique to the area. This is a flax breaker. In this area, there was a lot of farms that had an acre or two of flax, and down the foot of the hill, the next farm down, they flooded the outlet to Hedges Lake and laid the flax underwater, maybe a foot of water. After it got softened up, they still had to break it, the stalks, and this broke the fibers so that they used them to make linen cloth. Here's a little old stove made in Troy, New York, 1840. Use that to keep the museum warm. Nice little stove. Over in this corner, a lot of things used in kitchens on farms. Bread makers, soap makers, flour bins, sifters, all made mostly of tin. And that was the common thing. They didn't have much aluminum or dishes back then. Up on the wall is a collection of old cans and bottles, everything they used to store food in the canning jars, and everything came in bottles, patent medicines of all kinds. Underneath here are old hinges made by blacksmiths for doors and gates and barn doors and house doors. In here is a collection of old jewelry, old decorations, a collection of harmonicas. One of the interesting things I have in my collection is a 1830 muzzle loading pistol with a little ball and things, probably used to scare people. I doubt if it hit anybody more than 10 feet away and do any harm. But maybe, I don't know. Here's a cherry tool chest, all kinds of hand tools, mostly made by the people using them or the blacksmith, some of them, little hand saws, little hand axes. Drawers full of tools, some of them I don't even know what they're used for. Here's something I'm really proud of. This is the little wagon given to my grandfather when he was 4 years old in 1858. We've taken care of that. All our kids had their pictures taken in it. This corner cupboard is unique because I built it. It had some old chestnut boards that were cut at Civil War times. They were stored up on the beams in the barn, never used. And back in the 80s, I got them down, cleaned them, put them through a plane, and built this corner cupboard out of them so to show the lumber. Put it together from the inside out so there's no nails or screws or anything on the outside. And they're perfectly clean chestnut. That was the dominant woods back here, but the chestnut trees were killed by a blight around the turn of the century, and so their chestnut lumber now is a pretty rare thing. Here's a cradle from my aunt who was born in 1889. Brought it back with them, and pretty nice. Also used to have our kids' pictures taken in. A little old spinning wheel. Every farm had one. Practically every farm did. Used them for spinning wool as well as flax. Here's a little display case out of an old store. Right now I'm using it for Indian artifacts. We found most of this stuff on the farm. My grandfather and my father found most of it. I found a few. But when you were walking behind a team of horses and plowing and dragging fields, you saw these and picked them up. Indian heads, Indian arrowheads and spears and so forth. Once you got on a tractor, nobody picked them up anymore. Over in the corner is my mother's sewing machine, probably purchased in the 20s. Singer sewing machine. Of course, back then, farm wives made a lot of the clothes, repaired all the clothes you had. Also made all the kids' clothes, dresses, shirts and pants and so forth. So sewing machine was a very valuable thing to have in the house. The sewing machine was pedal powered, run it with your feet, and women were very dexterous using sewing machines. Some of them got extremely skilled in making clothes. I remember my mother used to make my sister's dresses, and she'd make a new dress for them in a day. They had a party they had to go to. Mom, I need a new dress. She'd make a new dress for them that night, and they have it the next morning. Our next museum originally was the hog pen. I turned it into a replica of an old post office. The post office you're going to see inside came from Bedlam Corners which is now West Hebron, and was taken out back in the 50s. It was stored in a barn, and I got it and built this situation in here to show off the post office, as well as things that you used to find in post offices, because they were all located in old grocery stores in every town. This is the auction bill my grandparents had before they left Illinois farms. This is the old 200 box post office, still has 1-cent stamps in it, 1-cent postcards, and the rest of the things are things that could be in the post office, could be in the grocery store. They always had checkerboard available because that's a gathering place for people. Old tables. This is a little kerosene stove. Basically took the place of what we now have as hot plates. And they always kept a tea kettle on there, hot water, make your coffee, and also cook your eggs in the morning on a little frying pan, whatever. When you didn't want to have the stove going, you just wanted a snack. I was a stamp collector when I was a kid and up through until I got married. And so I thought it was appropriate to put some of my stamp collection down here in the post office. But these were blocks of commemorative stamps in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Here's an old original Saturday Evening Post cover, the original cover. And the girl in the marbles is Ruth Skelly, who's a neighbor of ours. I had her sign it. Ruth's still alive, lives on the farm down here by the Bat and Kill. This is my grandmother's little old picture frame made out of butternut meats. Butternut cut in half, cut in slices, decorated the picture with it. This was done probably back in Civil War time. And anyways, I got the idea from it when I was in 8th grade in school. I cut butternuts put them in a vise and cut them and made buttons out of them. I'd cut a dozen of these at night, tie them together on a thread, dip them in a can of shellac, hang them up overnight. In the morning, I'd take the thread off, put them in an envelope, and take them to school and sell them to my teachers for Christmas presents. And the year I did it, I see in my diary that I sold 24 dozen. I think I got 25 cents a dozen for them. So that was my Christmas money that year. This is a collection of knives, jackknives, razors, old straight razors, hunting knives. Some of the collection was from my brother-in-law, who collected knives, and he gave me these to put in the museum. Now we're going into the library. The library is a little addition that I put on the hog pen, and it's got old reference books, it's got old magazines, it's got old phonograph records, sheet music, everything that was literature in the 1800s and a little bit into the 1900s, and a really nice old organ. Framed here in this picture, a chronological order of my farm buildings. This is the way it ended up with farm buildings, but here's the various stages of when they were added on to, starting in the, as it was in the 40s and ended up in the 90s. Here's a picture of district school with my father's picture in the district school, and here's one over here, my mother in her district school. The table's got a couple books that I've written, one of them, The Times of My Life, which is a history of from the time I was 5 years old and things I did. This is a book on thoughts. These are a collection of everything that I've written, poetry, short stories, articles, speeches, and picture of Polly and I, our wedding picture. On the back wall here is a collection of plates showing all the antique farm machinery. Old magazines, old farm magazines, and a collection of sheet music from the 1900s through to the 1950s. My wife Polly was a music teacher, and I sang in a dance band for a while, so that's why we got all this sheet music. But it's a nice collection of the pictures that were put on the sheet music are very interesting. Down here's a doll carriage around 1850. On the wall over here is a little checkerboard quilt that came with my great-grandmother from Scotland when she came over. That was given to her by her mother in 1854 to take with her to the new country. This organ was given to the Episcopal Church. They used it in their Sabbath school room for many years, and then they had a church auction, and I bought it at the auction. It's a mahogany 1885 pump organ. I built this bookcase to keep old books. I have some books here that are dating the early 1800s. Actually, the early books were weekly newspapers put together in a volume at the end of the year for people to keep. This is the Plowboy, 1820. And this is the collection of the Cultivator, which was the magazine put out by the New York State Ag Society. And this is dated 1840. That's the year they started. And in fact, the Ag Society is still going. It's the oldest continuous Ag Society in America. The other books are just a collection of books you found in school libraries, district school libraries, all kinds of antique books, records of the Departments of Agriculture. This shelf here is just reference books showing old antiques and all kinds of things that I use to find out the date and the value of some of the things in the museum. Got some old cameras. Here's an old Brownie camera. Here's an early 35 millimeter camera. Here's a 1940 movie camera. Well, this is a building I had to add, obviously, because it just didn't have any more room. And I call it the hand power to horsepower. Actually, inside there's all kinds of tools used by hand in the 1800s, buggies and sleighs and carts, obviously drawn by horses. But I also got an old 1931, was just like the first car that I remember my father buying. And I've got a milk truck that I acquired a few years ago that is really an historical antique. On this side of the museum, this museum is things used by every family in the 1800s. Here's a cutter, a sleigh used in the wintertime, you go to town or church. There's a little exercise cart that they used with one horse. The mares had babies and they had to train them, and they trained them on a little exercise cart where they couldn't do any damage. The next is a go-to-town cart. When you had to go to get groceries or anything, you had a little light cart with one horse, probably your fastest horse. Most families kept a team of horses for work and had either one of the teams of horses or maybe an extra horse that they just used on these vehicles for transportation. There's what they call a doctor's buggy. I don't know why it was labeled that, because everybody had one, but particularly doctors. And of course everything was house calls, so you had a covered buggy, rain or snow. In the early 40s, a neighbor and I cut logs and wood in the wintertime between milkings by hand, a crosscut saw and axes and wedges. I was interested because I began to see ads for chainsaws, so I became a dealer for the Titan Chainsaw Company in Seattle, Washington. And this is 1945, two-man, 12 horsepower, two-cylinder, 4-foot blade chainsaw. Weighs about 120 pounds. You were tireder in a day using that than you would with a crosscut saw, but you did accomplish about 5 times as much. Well, this is a double bobsleigh, and the box isn't with it, but this is a pretty fancy one, not used for anything except for transportation for the family. The box on it had probably 2 or maybe 3 seats mounted on the box or for people to sit in, drawn by one horse or a team, either one. And that was a kind of a fancy one in the 1800s. Just like people with their cars today, they take pride in having a little fancier one than their neighbor. This is a hop press imported from Madison County in central New York. Hop blossoms are very light, and in order to get a couple 100 pounds in a bag so that they could take them to the brewery, they put them in this hop press and kept pressing them down until they got a couple 100 pounds and wrapped in burlap, and then tied it up and took it to the press. This is a foot-powered treadle lathe, and in behind here is a series of stalk cutters, and here's cultivators that cultivate when we planted corn in hills in a field and cultivated it both ways with a one horse. And I traveled a good many rows of corn with this particular one right here. Here's a farmer, blacksmith made corn planter, planted 2 rows of corn at once, had a marker that marked the next row, and you run the wheel on the mark so that you had put the corn or beans, whichever you were planting in here, dropped them down underneath and covered them. Much better than using a hand corn planter like those up there. This was probably in the 1860s or 70s. This is a 1927 Chevrolet delivery truck. This was used for milk delivery by Hill Spring Farm over in Franklin, Massachusetts. I added it to the collection in 2010. But it's got old milk bottles, and it's got old cans and things y'all used in the 20s, when it was obviously through the 20s and 30s. It was used for milk delivery over in Massachusetts. Very nice shape, and I drive it once in a while, but not very far. This is a 1931 Essex, which was made by the Hudson Motor Company. This is identical with the first car I remember my father buying. We bought it down in Troy, drove it home in a rainstorm, and we'd had a open Model T before that. And I was just amazed as a kid that this had windshield wipers and the windows rolled up and down, and we drove home in the rain and we didn't get wet. This is one of the very early electric refrigerators, probably about 1925, General Electric, with a condenser motor for refrigeration on top. Corn is a major crop on all farms in Washington County and most of the state of New York. 10 or 12 acres of corn, which was used for fodder. Also, much of it was husked into ear corn. And to get it so it's used for chickens and pigs, and dairy cows, they had to shell it, get the kernels off the cob, and these are one of the machines. This one was happened to be made by the Eddy Plow Company in Greenwich, New York. But I've got a variety here made from Hoosick Falls and Cambridge and other places. And this is a hand corn planter, which farmers used to plant their corn. And back in those days, you saved corn from the previous year, and after you'd shelled it in one of these corn shellers, you planted corn with a jabber corn planter. This is an exhibit of horse-drawn plows. Plows were one of the very first implements made by man way back in Egyptian times. Because of different soil conditions, from gravel to loam to muck, clay, and so forth, there were a lot of different makes of plows depending on the area where they were used. Eddy Plow Works in Greenwich, Lovejoy Plow Works in Cambridge, and maybe another dozen or 2 dozen places in New York State all made plows. The ones that were liked the best by farmers, they continued to make them, and some of the others just went out of business. So I have a collection of plows here that were made from the early 1800s into the 1900s, and they have all very similar, but all have little distinctive things depending on where they were made and for what soil conditions they were made for. I'll just mention a few of the locally made plows and the differences in plows. This is a one-handle plow made by the Eddy Plow Company in Greenwich. Very unique because it's a one-handle 10-inch plow, cut a 10-inch furrow. This is a plow made by International Harvester Company, particularly for cutting sod, and has a little plow that broke the sod so it turned a smoother furrow. Here's a really old plow made by the Weird Plow Company in Batavia, New York, clear back in 1840. This is a Lovejoy plow made in Cambridge, New York, in the 1850s. And the others are very similar, but this happens to be one for digging potatoes. It has a special kind of plow where you went under a row of potatoes and dug them out, and the tines on the back, the dirt sifted through and left the potatoes on the top of the ground for picking them up. Back here in the back of the room, we have one of the early garden tractors, probably used in truck gardeners where they had maybe a couple acres of garden and not just a backyard garden. And the implements that with it, it was distributed by Sears and Roebuck Company. I don't know for sure who made it. It has a Fairbanks McMorris gasoline engine on it, but it had plows and discs and drags and implements to use behind it. Next, we're going to look at some tractors that were the first small tractors that took the place of teams of horses in the transition between horse farming and tractor farming. This is a 1960 cockshut tractor made in Canada, about a 30 horsepower tractor. This is a Ferguson 30, a very famous little tractor made by the Ferguson Company originally in England, then moved to Canada. and one of the models made by Ferguson himself before he merged with Ford Ferguson. There's another 25 horsepower tractor. This is a Farmall Cub tractor with a 5-foot mowing machine mounted on it. This is a 15 horsepower tractor made in 1948. Then we come to a popular model. This is a Farmall C, made in 1950. About a 22, 23 horsepower tractor. And these groups of tractors demonstrate the first commonly used tractors that took the place of a team of horses. That's why the small tractors, basically beginning, they were used with the equipment we already had. We cut off the tongues on the wagons and so forth so you could pull them with a tractor. And then in the period starting in the 30s, in the 40s, companies started making more equipment to be used with tractors. But these small tractors were the transition between horses and tractor power. This is a Ward tractor made by a company in Indiana that made tractors for a variety of other companies. This was distributed by Montgomery Ward and Company from 1948 to 1952. 60 horsepower tractor, one of the first very successful larger tractors, still being used in tractor drawing contests, and has been pretty dominant in that size tractor. This is a 1936 Farmall F12 tractor, about 18 horsepower, on metal lug wheels. At this particular time, you could buy a tractor with rubber tires or steel wheels. In this hilly country, farmers thought the rubber tires were going to slide on the hills, and they really didn't have much tread on them back then either. So most farmers still used iron wheels, lug tires up until the 40s. This is a little Massey Harris pony tractor. Massey Harris made a variety of small tractors, pony, colt, and so forth. This is about a 12 horsepower tractor. It had many uses. It drew wagons. It had mowing machines, had cultivators, cultivate corn with, a handy little small tractor. Here's probably the most famous tractor ever built, the Farmall H, built in 1939, and they built them through 1953. I had a 1941. This happens to be the last year they made them, in 1953. They sold 385,000 Farmall H tractors, and it's still to this day the largest number of a single model tractor ever built. It's a 28 horsepower, and there's still many of them being used on farms even today. This is one of the very first one-man chainsaws built by Precision Company in Montreal, Canada. Their first ones were made in 1943. This is a 1945 model, and I was a salesman for them for a few years and sold about 40 of these saws in the Salem area. This is a display of chainsaws, first one-man saws, a variety of makes that I had when I was in the chainsaw business. Below them is on display are some crosscut saws run by two men for years and years and years prior to the mechanization of chainsaws. On this wall I have some things that were used in building post and beam barns and houses. These are the axes that were used to hew timbers. These are the drilling bits that were used to build holes, drill holes for the pegs where they fasten beams together. Here's their various tools for draw shaves and levels and adds and things to use in the process. Then from here on, the rest of this walls in this building have size and forks, wooden forks, all kinds of tools used in harvesting hay, grain, corn, used out in the fields. And they're displayed on these walls. We're in the old museum for farm tools, hand tools mostly, but things used on farms in the 1800s and early 1900s. This happens to be a wooden cow stanchion, where they tie cow up for milking in the barn, made in East Barnet, Vermont. This is a craftsman's cabinet maker's tool chest, very fancy, made out of chestnut. This is a display of hand saws of all different sizes and for different uses, different kinds of wood, different kinds of here's a keyhole saw for making, as it says, keyholes. Here's meat saws for sawing through bones and butchering and in butcher shops. Here's a lot of hand saws for carpenter use. Back here we get into old tools, planes. On the back wall we have a lot of antique tools, many of them made by hand by blacksmiths for a particular job. We have some old horseshoes made by blacksmiths, and a variety of things for leather work and punching holes in leather. Over here is another display of old tools. Back in the 1800s, every piece of equipment you bought had its own wrench that came with it because there wasn't standardization of tools, and so that's why we have such a variety of wrenches. Here's a forge that used to crank and use coal or coke for heating iron, and here's some of the tools they use in making horseshoes and other farm equipment. Blacksmith was a very valuable person in the farming communities for doing all kinds of things that need to be fixed. This is a shaker saw vise. This is to put crosscut saw blades in for sharpening, and it locks them in, and also up here on the below where the teeth are, it has marks on the thing to angle to hold your file so that you get the right angles on the sharpening points. Next we have a ice box, insulated pine box, zinc inside, probably used in hotels or restaurants for cakes of ice, where they chip off ice as they needed it for other uses in the hotel. Could put food in it, but probably didn't. Made in 1904. Next is a cobbler's bench. It's maybe the oldest thing I got. This is probably made late 1700s, early 1800s, all pegged together with wooden pegs, no nails or screws or of any kind. And it was used for a variety of things where you could sit on it, put your feet on the lever on the bottom to hold things. You would make shingles, baskets, weaving, all kinds of things where you had to use your hand, leather working, where you had to hold something still and had your hands free for working on it. Called a cobbler's bench, but used for many other things too. I think this gets the highlights of this tool museum number 2. This is an 1870 McCormick hay wagon. It had fills on the front for one horse. They rotted away. I'm getting new ones built for loose hay, obviously, back then. And it was one horse, and pitched it on by hand and drew it into the barn. Sitting on top of it is what they call a flip-flop rake. It was used to rake hay up into piles out in the field.
Next, we're going into dairy equipment and laundry.
The oldest and probably most important piece in the museum is this first mechanical milker. In fact, the tit cups are gone up of it, as you can see, but in this picture it's got them. This was showed at the State Fair in 1865. Everybody was trying to figure out some way of milking cows without using your hands, And this was one of the first ones that was tried. None of them worked very well, but in the process they kept improving them until they finally got milk machines around the turn of the century that would work. And so this was one of the very earliest ones, and it may be only one or two and still in existence. This is a milk tester to test the butter fat of individual cows or sample from a whole herd. And it was done with a combination of sulfuric acid and warm water, and filled it up into the neck, which is calibrated, put into this spun for 5 minutes, and butterfat being the lightest of the components, it ended up with a column of butterfat up on the neck of these little bottles that they measured with a caliper, whether it's 3.5%, 4%, 2.5%, whatever the individual milk sample was. These are a variety of tools used in making butter, separating milk from fat from milk to make butter. Back in the 1800s and early 1900s, a lot of the milk on farms was turned into cheese and butter so it could be stored because we didn't have adequate refrigeration for shipping it very far. Well, these were a variety of churns for churning milk to make butter. And this table here was a mechanism they put butter, spread the butter out on the table, and turned the handle, and that went from end to end of the table to work out all the buttermilk, so the butter wouldn't get rancid. Then they would put it in crocks like this, and this, and so forth, and store it. On the back wall is a collection of milk bottles when there's home delivery and up until the middle 30s, everything was in glass bottles, and then we gradually went into paper and plastic. But every dairy in every town had one or two dairies, and they all had their own names, so it's quite a collector's item. And there's collectors that have thousands of these bottles, but I've just got a few. This is one of the common milking machines. This is a surge milking machine used in the 20s and 30s and 40s. This is a universal without the tit cups on it. Underneath it is a little electric refrigerated water cooler to put milk cans of milk in all night. Over in the corner here is one of the very first bulk tanks that everybody uses now. This was 1954. This is old 300 gallons, or for a dairy of about 30 cows. Picked up every other day. This shows that in 10 years, everybody in the dairy business nationwide using bulk tanks to cool their milk. This was the kind of stool that farmers sat on beside a cow, milking into a pail when they milked everything by hand. A good milker could milk 8 to 10 cows night and morning. We want to remember then cows gave at each milking maybe 10 to 15 pounds of milk, where today they give 50 to 60 pounds of milk each milking. 10-gallon milk cans that everybody shipped their milk from the farm to the processing plant or the milk plant. And you had these sitting in the barn where you were milking. And this was a strainer with a cloth in the bottom that you poured the milk through so that any dirt or chaff or pieces of straw or hairs off the cow or whatever happened to get in the milk was taken out before it was put into the milk can. Somewhere in the early teens, 1910 or so, became experimenting on how to separate butter cream out of milk without having to do it by gravity and skimming it. And this was a machine with a centrifuge in it that take whole milk, and run through the machine. And because the cream is lighter than whole milk or the skim milk, it spun the cream to the outside of this little container here, and the cream came out one spout and the skim milk came out another. It was a tremendous invention. Changed the whole context of the dairy industry, and had small ones for dairy farms, larger ones for manufacturing plants, and this was one made by the International Separator Company in Binghamton, New York, 1925. The washing process in every home was a real chore, generally done every Monday, and washed the clothes in various wash machines, from using them totally by hand and scrub boards to early mechanical wash machines. Here's one of the 1915 copper electrified easy washer. After coming out of the wash machine, whichever one they're using, into a wet tub, run through a roller to take out as much moisture as it could into a dry basket, then taken out, hung on the clothesline outdoors if the weather was permissible, or on a indoor rack like this if it wasn't. Of course, after things got dried, here's an old wooden ironing board, and here's the irons that were used. The early ones were all iron, heated on top of the stove. Had to use a padded handle thing to keep from burning your hands on it. Then they invented the wooden handle that was detachable. Everything ironed, the shirts and clothes, all kinds. Next, we're going into the antique art gallery. My father's older sister, Jenny May McGuire, was an accomplished artist, and she went through Syracuse University, studied art, worked her way through by taking a year off and illustrating magazines in New York City. In this exhibit, I have an exhibit of her charcoal work, which was all done between 1912 and 1918. Some of it was used in her illustrated magazines, and others were just artwork. She gave a collection of this to me in the 1960s, and I've had about 35 of them framed and make up this exhibit. Jenny May McGuire, later Jenny May Bennett, was my father's older sister, born in 1889 in Illinois. She demonstrated in high school that she had talent in art. Her teachers persuaded her to try to get into Syracuse University to study art, which was a very unusual thing for a farm girl, particularly. Any women back in the early 1900s many of them didn't go to college. If they did, it was only for a short course to teach school or be a nurse. She had to submit a drawing. This was a pen drawing that she did in high school to submit with her application to Syracuse. Her husband was the vice president of Niagara Mohawk, which was at that time called Central New York Power and Light. And when I knew her, she did mostly oil paintings. But working her way through Syracuse University, she took a couple different years off and did illustrations for magazines in New York City. During that period of time, 1912 to 1918, she did a whole lot of charcoals. And this exhibit is basically an exhibit of her charcoal work done in that period of time. She taught art in schools in Amsterdam and also at the Vermont Junior College in Poultney, Vermont, which at that time was called Troy Conference Academy, a school sponsored by the Methodist Church in the Troy Conference. She had problems in teaching school because she was also a clairvoyant, and she had trouble with the kids because she was answering their questions before they asked the questions. Had one particular story that's worth telling. When she was teaching school in Amsterdam, New York, she stayed at a boarding house with two other teachers. one winter night she had a meeting at school and didn't come home till about 9 o'clock. As she came in the house, the door into the parlor on the left-hand side, which was never opened, was ajar, and she looked in, and there was a little boy sitting in front of the fireplace. She says to him, "Be careful, you don't get burned," and she went on up to bed. The next morning at breakfast, she asked the landlady if she had company, and she says, "No." "Why do you ask?" She says, "Well, last night when I came home, I opened the door was open into the parlor. There was a fire in the fireplace, and a little boy sitting in front of the fireplace." The landlady immediately jumped from the table, went into the parlor, and my aunt, Jenny May, followed her in and says, "Did I say something wrong? What's happened?" She says, "My little boy brother burned up at that fireplace 50 years ago last night." Jenny May went on and did oils, a lot of landscapes, and as far as I knew, I didn't know she'd done the charcoals until she gave me them. But she'd come out here and go over in Vermont and do the marble quarries and all kinds of things, as well as portraits. She never entered the commercial market, but she showed a lot of them at museums and shows. And, I had a man do some research on them, and she has one in Smithsonian Institute in Washington that got there because it was bought by a state at a raffle in Utica where she lived, included in their collection, and they gave the whole collection to the Smithsonian. So she has one there. I haven't seen it myself. She had one child that died of leukemia when he was 12 years old, so she spent a lot of time out here with myself and my sisters, and come out from Utica 2 or 3 times a year. She passed away in '73. The center part of this old barn was built in 1790, and it was just hand-hewn timbers, and boards, the roof were sawed through and through, never edged, had shingles on top, had a hay mow, and this, where I'm standing, is where we drove into the wagon with a team of horses and a load of hay, loaded off into the mow on the right-hand side. So this is turned into my museum for larger machinery. It has a few pieces that are of interest, particularly the old thrash machine in the corner. There are many wooden thrash machines. Most fairgrounds and museums have wooden thrash machines. They were used in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. This particular one happens to be special made for a special job. It was owned by a man down in Rensselaer County whose business was trucking produce out of Massachusetts and Vermont and New York to the Port of Albany. He had 20 teams of horses and the appropriate wagons and sleighs to carry potatoes, grain, hay, lumber, apples, whatever, to ship to the market in New York City. When he was doing it in the late 1800s, the people on the barges told him that the fancy writing paper companies in New York City were having trouble finding rye straw and flax straw that was long sections of it, because the thrash machines had come in the rest of the world, and straw was all broken up into small pieces. So he went to Ohio to a company out there and built this thrash machine for that particular purpose. It has a 6-foot throat on it, and he could put rye straw, mostly rye straw, through it without breaking the straw. The beater just took off the heads on one end. The straw went through a hole, probably 4, 5, 6 foot long, and was tied into bundles on the back of the thrash machine before it ever hit the ground. He used to take 50, 60 of those small bundles on his wagon, all tied in with ropes into a big bundle, and shipped it to New York City. So this is a 1898 thrash machine, but it was built for a very specific purpose and is unique. This is a hay loader pulled behind a hay wagon, used in the 20s and 30s to load hay of a windrow of hay in the field. Over the back of the wagon are 2 men on the wagon piling it. and just drove a team straddle a windrow around the field, loaded hay instead of pitching it on by hand. These are two long mowing machines. This first one was made by Walter A. Wood Company in Hoosick Falls in 1880. The Walter A. Wood Company, 1880, 1900, was the largest manufacturer of mowing machines in the world. This happens to be a small one. This is a one-horse mowing machine, cut 4 foot at a time, but he had them in all sizes. Behind it is a McCormick Deering mowing machine, 6-foot cutter, with a team of horses or a tractor. 50 years difference between these two mowing machines, and yet it demonstrates that in that period of time there were no changes. This is the same mechanism in 1880 as there is in 1930. All the time that farmers were using horses, there was very little difference in the machines they used or the equipment they used. It wasn't until tractors came along that they began to change the implements that were used. This is what is called a fan reaper. This very much like a mowing machine, except this is used to cut grain, oats, wheat, barley, anything like that. And it had these 4 fans on it that could be set so that every time around they swept what was cut on the table off onto a pile. If there was a heavy crop, it swept it off every time by. If it was a light crop, they could set it every other time or every third time. And the fans also served the purpose of pushing the grain stalks into the mowing machine, so that mowing part of the equipment so it didn't run over it. For many years, corn was cut in loose bundles in the field, and just in piles and picked up loose and put on a wagon, brought in to blow in the silo. Later it was tied in bundles, but still this machine here was used to feed it through, chop it into small pieces and blow it up a pipe into the silos. This last piece of equipment was known as a seeder. It was used to seed grain, but it had additional features on it. It also had a little cover where you had fertilizer. You had one where you had grass seed. You had one where you had oats or wheat or barley, whatever you were sowing, so that application all at the same time, put it in the ground and covered it. And you had your fertilizer and your grass seed that came up the second year, and your oats or wheat or barley that came up the same year. Over my head is a wheel hoist. It's a round timber that ropes rolled on and hooks down onto the ground, and the wheel gave you leverage to turn it, and it was used to lift up a wagon for greasing the wheels or changing the wheels on a wagon, or lifting up anything that needed to be hoisted off the ground. And you want to realize that they didn't have hydraulic jacks back then, and the farmer was all by himself unless he got his wife out to help him, and he needed something that increased his physical ability to lift something heavy. We've just concluded a tour of Penope Farm's museums. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. The reason for this and the incentive I had for doing it was that my father, back in the 1970s, and 3 other retired farmers decided that it was necessary to save the old horse equipment that was used on farms in the 1800s. And so they started the Washington County Museum at the Washington County Fairgrounds. I also was interested, and so because of his interest and his activity in that area, I started collecting things for this museum. Recognizing the fact that looking at the equipment and the tools and the household utensils that people used in the 1800s gave us a better idea of how they lived than reading it out of a book, because the tools that people used really demonstrated the kind of life, the kind of activities they carried out. So that's what we've collected here at Penope Farm's Museum, the things used in fields, barns, and homes, and I hope you enjoyed looking at them.